Good morning, everyone. We're going to talk about the causes of forgetting and give some very simple and effective and direct solutions to get forgetting out of your life, because the causes are very well known, but we sometimes forget to focus on removing those well-known causes, and we have some very well-known solutions, but we often forget to use those well-known solutions. And then there are some nitty-gritty things that aren't so well-known, and they aren't shared as much as they could be. Sometimes that's because they're not that easy. That's because they're a little bit complex. They're a little bit less than fun to put into action, but we need to know that they exist anyway in order to at least have the chance to explore them and put them into action and use them to set ourselves free. So Sean is here in New Jersey. Good to see you, Sean. If you're joining us, let me know in the chat where you're from. Hit that thumbs up. And this is an opportunity, a public service, to help spread the good news about memory techniques. So ask any questions that you have at any time, and we will catch up with them in the chat here. And I'd like to know what are some of the causes of forgetting that I may have neglected to include in this presentation so that we can add them to future messages and help people further in terms of getting those out of our lives, because the more that we know, the more we can grow, if you'll forgive a little bit of rhyming, feel-good cliche there. But, cliche is important in life sometimes. Now, before we get started, just in case you missed it, there's a new video on the channel with some episodic memory exercises. And one of the things that's so important about these kinds of exercises is that they help unlock multiple levels of memory. So we're talking about spatial memory, autobiographical memory, figural memory, etc., all the science words. And we're going to talk a little bit about science today because it can help you get rid of these causes of forgetting, especially when we get into the technical stuff about improving how you're using memory techniques, because it's useful to know a little bit about the science and how that actually is an explanation for why memory techniques work better and why they don't work when you're not using them in the most optimal and best possible way. So make sure you go through these exercises, because they are not just stuff that I'm pulling out of nowhere. It's thinking deeply about what the science says, creating some experiments, going in, and then seeing how it lends to practice. And it lends a lot to practice. And it's very, very clear why, from a neurochemical, neuroscientific level, even if I'm not a neuroscientist. I've thought lots about going and getting my PhD, another one, in this area. I don't think it will do that much because people don't pay that much attention to science. If science was the best persuasive weapon, we'd have a much better world right now, don't you think? So in any case, if you're just joining us, hit the thumbs up. Let me know where you are in the world, what you're doing, what you're thinking. Look for this video on the channel. And if you missed it, we had a live stream about achieving eternal bliss, if such a thing is possible. We probably figured out how on that channel, but I know that's very an ambitious thing to say. Check it out for yourself. So to get started, what is forgetting? Well, this is the question, right? And we need to actually think about this, because if we know what forgetting is, we're better able to tackle it. Lady B is in the house. She says, I heard you talking about there's no such thing as free will. It's selection. What's the difference between selection versus choice? Isn't it the same? Great question, Lady B. Thanks, by the way, for your super chat on the last one and your great questions, and for noticing this distinction between free will, selection, and choice, and so forth. This is a very interesting question, and it does blend into forgetting and these kinds of distinctions we're going to get into. So basically, at one level, this might seem like a semantic differentiation between selection and choice, but it really isn't, because choice is the illusion that you have free will, at least at some level. So if we're in a grocery store, you can say, well, I chose Red Delicious instead of some other brand of apple, right? But you didn't really choose Red Delicious. You selected from the available choices, so to speak, right? So yes, you could say you chose, but you really didn't have any choice in the matter. What you had was the ability to select from a frame of reference. And that matters. That difference matters because a lot of people punish themselves for not being able to achieve certain things in life when they never had the choice to be able to do so in the first place. They were only able to select from a limited set of references, right? And so this is really something that you can use to set yourself free of all kinds of suffering. People are suffering because they haven't been able to accomplish things they never could accomplish in the first place because it's simply not selectable within a frame of reference. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't do certain things using acts of will in order to enable yourself to be able to have a larger frame of reference from which to select, but it just means that any sort of, and we're going to talk about this in terms of causes of forgetting, is that people use a lot of self-punishing mechanisms to make it even harder and worse for themselves, when if they just would change the story, then they won't have so many causes of forgetting. So we'll get into that, but I hope, Lady B, that helps answer your question for now. And we can get deeper into it, because it is ultimately the fundamental question at the end of the day in terms of solving a lot of issues. And Lady B says that's true when you say it like that. Well, the truth is often something that's emerging, but see how it works out in your own experience. And the more you dwell upon it, I think the more you'll see that it's a very powerful tool to look at the world in this way and to actually operate within the world in this way and let go of the need for outcomes, which is another cause of forgetting that we will talk about today. Stefan is here, fellow Canuck from Ottawa. Keep up the good work. Thank you for being here, and thanks for saying hello, and nice to meet somebody in Ottawa. There's actually Forest Strategy is also there. I don't know if he's going to show up here today. Brundiver is his other name. Got to keep track of the different names for him, but maybe you guys can meet up at some point. Because if memory serves, he's also in Ottawa. All right. Mont Entertainment says, I'm 14. Anthony helped me master the Mary Palace. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for being so young and thinking about these techniques. The best thing I would suggest is go to magneticmarymethod.com/YT, complete that course. And if you want to master the Mary Palace, that's the greatest way to start. As we'll talk about today, one of the things that you need to do is actually complete training, have the big bird's eye view, and then practice the techniques. So mastery is the continual devotion to getting better at the techniques. And I had a really interesting email that I still need to answer from someone in the masterclass and has a number of my books, and basically was saying, I get it, I'm able to do these things, but how is it that I'm not able to do it as well as I want? And the answer is practice. It's just, that's the shortest answer. Obviously, there's some more nuance. I have to read more about the details of the email, ask a little bit more, and see what's going on there. But at the end of the day, almost certainly the answer is practice and depth of study, which is why we always talk about the SIP principle, taking things one step at a time, which is to study the techniques, continue to study the techniques, and then implement what you learned from studying and practice with information that improves your life. That's the SIP, study, implement, and practice. And the more you study, the more you have to implement, the more you have to try more angles, because not every brain is exactly the same, even though memory techniques and memory itself operates on universal principles, right? We need to see that there are some variations in there, and there's timing variations, there's competence variations. You may be very rusty in certain areas that some memory techniques draw more heavily upon, so then you need to go and use some other memory techniques and develop in different areas in order to pick up speed and be able to actually have the competence needed for some of the techniques. So that's very, very important. So hope that helps you out there, Month Entertainment. And I kind of like that MON hitting a THND. That's very unique. Love that. I wonder what that's all about. Gene Torres is here from New York City. Excellent. I wonder whereabouts in New York City. As you may know, I lived in Washington Heights there for 2 years, or just under 2 years, I guess, better counted. But you could also say more than, depending on your tolerance for real estate. Great to have you here, Gene, and wonderful. I always like seeing New York City. It brings back so many memories of, in some ways, the world's ultimate memory palace collection. David is here. Great to see you. Great to see you as well. You've been watching lots of Mr. Langford's videos since your live stream. I'm practicing what he suggests. Excellent. Well, I'm glad that you took that up. He's quite a character, isn't he? So if you missed the last stream on eternal bliss, be curious to see what you think about that. And his insistence that you need to practice your memory above all in order to even have a chance at meditating properly is a very good point. I would agree with that, at least in my own experience. And one of the things you need to understand really is that using memory techniques is mindfulness in many, many ways. If I ever do get a PhD, I'd probably, my second PhD would be in neuroscience, and I'd probably focus on the realms of where memory training and meditation meet, because it's pretty obvious looking at it from the outside and not as educated as I would like to be, that those two places are pretty much the same. And when we look historically, the memory demands placed on the true, scholars of those techniques are just huge, right? And no wonder they got quote unquote enlightened, because it would certainly exercise so much of the brain to the point that your worries and suffering and so forth would just disappear, not only because you memorized the messages so completely, memorize the teaching so completely and put it into practice as part of what helped you memorize it, but it would just change the whole situation neurochemically in your brain. Scott is here. Good to see you, Scott. Thanks for being here. And I see that Chanel is in the house. Good to see you, Chanel. Chanel says, can't memory loss be said by traumatic injury such as brain imagery, for example? If someone has suffered this type of injury, they can't help out but to have temporary memory loss or permanent memory loss, depending on what the situation was that causes the memory loss to occur in the first place. Great point, Chanel. Actually, there was a guy, Michael Gussman, he was on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, and he shared something that connected with things that I've studied in memory training, which is called passive memory training. And so, yes, you could have those sorts of things. I didn't talk about brain trauma here today in my slide preparation, but good point. And one of the things that has been very, very helpful is called passive memory training. So maybe we can pick that up a little bit more as we go through. Scott is here. Good to see you, Scott. Excellent, excellent. So Gene is originally from Fort Greene, Brooklyn. Excellent. Wonderful. So I was never there, but I have seen a fair amount of Brooklyn. I lived for a while off and on in Dumbo, so not too deep into Brooklyn at all, but definitely made an impact on my brain. So I actually lived in the clock tower, so that was kind of cool. All right, so thanks everyone for being here, being active in the chat. Keep it coming. Hit that thumbs up. It's your thumbs up, as well as the world's. Let the robots know that humans care about this tradition, and let me know where you are in the world, what you're doing, what you're thinking, and let's get into what is forgetting, because this will be helpful to actually think about the different things that forgetting could be. So forgetting could be that memory has disappeared. It's literally gone. It could be that. Now, if that's actually possible, I don't know. But it could be. It could be that something in the chemistry completely dies. So when we look at neurons and so forth, these dendritic spines grow, and the strength of memory seems to be correlated with the strength of these spines that grow in the garden of memory, right? And so if they were to completely wither and die, it could be that memory is just gone, totally gone. So that's a possibility if you've forgotten something. Could be that it literally is no longer in your head neurochemically. And that's why actually you could potentially have the feeling of, well, I know what that is. I have known it in the past because some of the other connections are there, but the link needed, the actual spine needed to draw the connection to completely fill it in is actually gone. So you have this sort of ghost in the shell, so to speak. You can't access it because it just simply isn't there, even if other remnants around it are there. And as Chanel pointed out, there could be a brain trauma sort of thing in there. And if you had knowledge that you lost, maybe that's just traumatic in and of itself. But that's one thing that we need to consider. It could be that neurochemically it's just no longer there. The cells that had contained it have died or otherwise been displaced. And there is a displacement theory of memory, and that's very interesting to look into. The other thing is that it could be that something is blocking or interfering with retrieval. Now, later on today, we'll talk about the kinds of things that could be blocking or interfering with retrieval. It's not even just that it can be blocking or interfering with retrieval. It can also be blocking or interfering with encoding it in the first place, which we'll also talk about, because there are some key obvious things that I think a lot of people don't think about, but they're the highest levers to push in order to get past this. This has to do with overthinking things, but why do we overthink things? Got some clues that if you're an overthinker will help you. We talked about them before, but not from this exact angle. And speaking of people who are overthinkers who don't think enough, SpiderMan. If you haven't seen Far From Home, I recommend it. It's pretty good. It's pretty good because it shows that human paradox in which we overthink and don't think enough about a lot of things. And while he's overthinking about how he's going to tell his girlfriend that he likes her, or his girlfriend to be that he likes her, he's not thinking enough about some of the decisions that he makes, one in particular that is particularly dumb, but all too human. All too human. All right, and then the last thing is that it never entered memory in the first place. So that's obviously the biggest cause of forgetting, and we'll talk about some solutions about how to make sure that that doesn't happen as much as possible. It will happen from time to time, but there are things that just never entered memory in the first place, and that obviously is a bad cause of forgetting, especially when you wanted it to enter memory. David says, separate question. I watched a Netflix show with Nelson and Yanja. They mentioned using a lot of emotions in their imagery memorizing. I find I have no emotions in my memorizing. What can I try? Wow, that's interesting. So emotions are huge, right? They're one of the least utilized of the modes and one of the most powerful. And if you don't have emotions in your memorizing, one thing you can try is go through your life and think of emotions that you have had and start to experience them. So this would be emotional excavating. And probably the fastest and quickest path to finding emotions, good or bad, assuming you had them, would be your birthdays. So if you go back and you try and think of all the birthdays you can remember, almost certainly there will be emotions associated there, unless you have a cold, dark soul. I don't know. But I'm thinking, I remember when I got a Kiss album for one of my birthdays, and that was just so amazing. And just that feeling of happiness that I had this Kiss album, because, back then it wasn't that often that you could actually watch TV, and then it wasn't that often that you could actually see the music video that you wanted to see to hear the song that you wanted to hear. It was super random, right? And I just wanted to hear Crazy Nights as much as I could. And so now I have two emotions, right? The emotion of craving something, and then the emotion of having that craving satisfied on autopilot, because now I had the cassette, right? And also, there was something about the object of a cassette at the time, and this contented peace and wonder of sitting with Walkman on, or, it'd be in the cassette player. We used to have these cassette players with the handle. They were horizontal in nature, and put in the Kiss album there with the crappy little headphones, and, just press play and read the lyrics. Wow. I mean, all these emotions are coming, and they're not super strong in my memory, but satisfaction, contentedness, and then of course the music, right? Like what Kiss represents is, this swagger, this confidence, this incredible hip and cool control, mastery of your life situation. Like those are all kinds of emotion. You might not think of mastery over life as an emotion, but what else is it? It's this feeling, right? So I hope that gives you some clues. And if you just go through your birthdays, I'm sure you'd find oodles and oodles of emotions that way. Go through movies, go through books you've read, etc. Adolfo is in the house. Good to see you, Adolfo. Always good to see you. How you been? Have you seen the new SpiderMan yet? It's amazing. And there's another example for you, David. I just can think back of this movie I saw a few days ago, and it's got everything, thrills and chills and spills. And then you get all these opinions about, oh, the movie could have been better, or this was bad, or about it, or whatever. I think movies are huge for accessing into emotions because they're trying to get you to feel those emotions. So I just said like how stupid Spider-Man was. And the reason why the low level of his stupidity in this particular movie is so incredibly functional, why it works, is because we are that stupid from time to time. So there's another emotion that you can tap into and use as a memory tool. The other thing too that's really powerful in Spider-Man is the notion of privacy and embarrassment about revelation, right? They really, really dig into that heavy, especially near the end, right? So, oh man, there's so many emotions that you can tap into. Now, how exactly to get them to work in your memory work is, okay, so I got the mop from Fantasia with the 9 of diamonds, or a series of mops, whatever I do in that case, and now we have the 7 of hearts. So these mops are going to be bashing into the 7 of hearts, which is Orson Welles. And, to get an emotion in there, Orson Welles is just like angry at the mops, right? And so what is he going to do? Well, then if the next card is 8 of spade, then he's going to do something with the television sweet transvestite sort of image that I've got going on there, and his anger is going to be involved. So maybe he's throwing the mops into the TV, which is smashing, and then he becomes incredibly disappointed because it's his favorite TV with a transvestite on it, that sort of thing. And Dr. Frankenfurter, who is the sweet transvestite from Transylvania, right? He's going to be angry now, and then he's going to do this with Dashiell Hammett, and Dashiell Hammett, of course, is always throwing his dishes around, and it's just this endless chain of actions guided by emotions. So I hope that helps answer your question, David, and gives you some things to practice. Great question. Thank you for that. If you're just joining us, hit the thumbs up. Let us know where you are in the world, what you're doing, what you're thinking, and any comments, questions you have. Let's get into them. All right. So these are some of the causes of forgetting, and they're very, very important to think through, ponder, to use. Month Entertainment says, Joshua 4 said it is easy to remember, but the challenge is forgetting. Is that true? He's the writer of Moonwalking with Einstein. Indeed, he is. Well, the whole point is what we're going to talk about today when we get through some of this presentation. So let's keep that in mind. The challenge is forgetting, and that is true, but there's differences that depend on the nature of the information. They depend on the level of your skill. And so one of the things that we need to do above all is avoid generalizations. There's nothing that really can be said that's going to be true for all situations, for all people. So I wouldn't worry about the truth of that from his perspective and the nature of the information that he's talking about. What we need to worry about is what's true for you, when is it true, and when is the truth of what you've decided going to be your friend or your enemy? Because usually our reliance on the truth becomes a frenemy, and it's useful when we don't need it to be, or when we're not able to access its usefulness, and it's unuseful at the last and least time that we want it to be useful. So don't be too sure about any of these statements. Figure it out in the context of your own practice, and then realize that there's no certainty whatsoever other than your development of the competence to do what it is you need to get done at the moment that you need to get it done. And even then you may sometimes not hit the mark. And if you're going to follow competition stories like Joshua 4's, then you have to realize that winning is very contingent upon the nature of the other competitors on that day, right? So it's points-based. And so winning is something that is heavily contingent upon a lot of factors. And those factors do not necessarily have anything, and often have nothing, to do with everyday learning when we use these techniques for knowledge-based outcomes, which is what we focus on in the magnetic memory method world. Not to say that that won't help us if we want to compete, because it will, and we'll see an example of that today. All right, so when we're thinking about causes of forgetting, we can actually split it into at least 2 categories, and we'll just work with 2 categories today. And the first category will be biological causes of forgetting, and the second will be behavioral causes. Now, one would make the mistake about we would want to make the mistake that one is more important than the other, but actually they work together. All right, so Scott says, Anthony, how do you feel about the art of forgetting? Enlighten me. What is the art of forgetting? Please let me know. Generally, when these questions come out and references to things come out, please don't assume that anybody knows what you're referring to, even with Moonwalking with Einstein. And so Month there did a great job of making sure that his reference to Joshua 4 was complete in terms of citing the book that the author wrote that he's referring to. So, as you know, assumption makes you know what out of you and me. So, biological causes versus behavioral ones. Number one cause really is stress. So people are stressed out. We'll talk more about stress and how to solve that in a minute, because one of the biggest things that causes stress is in your mind, and it's a behavioral problem, and we'll get that sorted. Ideally, for those who have ears to hear and eyes to see, you will no longer need to have stress interfering with your memory efforts whatsoever. Another is alcohol. Look, I'm not going to preach at people. I drank for many, many years, and I used memory techniques successfully. And, you know, the alcohol did not cause such a big problem when I needed it. I mean, I would do magic routines totally blitzed out of my skull and still remember everybody's name and, you know, do my mem deck stuff, and it would be fine. But I'm not proud of it, and my memory got a lot better after I got rid of alcohol. So, you know, take it as you will for your own thing, and it's kind of paradoxical, but you could still use memory techniques successfully, at least in my experience, at the age that I was at and the level of practice, etc. But it's not a great brain strategy at all, and it's not a great memory strategy to try and get away with both things. So I personally wish that I would have gotten rid of alcohol a lot sooner because of some problems external that actually also impeded with my memory in some very, very difficult ways. So another thing is poor sleep or lack of sleep that will impede with your memory. This is partly a behavioral thing, but sometimes people have medical conditions that certainly are not drawing upon behavior, or who knows. You just got to think about why that you might have a lack of sleep problem. Then you have medication issues, and medication issues can be very, very huge, including poisonous memory supplements. So if you've been following the Magnetic Memory Method adventure for any amount of time, you know I've had a hard line against any kind of supplementation for memory, specifically because there's so much research that does not support any of it other than a 0.05 verbal memory advantage. But I did come across a supplement that I was very, very interested in trying, and I'm trying it now, and I can't say that there's any special advantage to it in a memory thing in an n=1 anecdotal realm. And I don't think that it has fulfilled any of its promises, but I'm not the best test subject in the world. And what I'll do is, after I finish the trial with the actual potion, so to speak, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and make the potion myself, because it's only got 3 major substances, and all of them are readily accessible anywhere. And then I'll see if I can actually make the potion better on my own, ideally with the help of my wife, and maybe we'll make a video about how to make it if it works. But at the end of the day, it really has nothing to do with supplementation. And its benefits that it's created are not particularly profound. I think meditation and drinking water do just the same. So that's that. And I always like to test my own assumptions. And so far, you know, it's only been a week, and we'll need to go a little bit deeper into it. But one of the problems is that people are already on a lot of medications. Then they take memory supplements on top of those medications, and they're creating unintended side effects that are very, very deadly in some cases, and causing negative results, not positive results. So really, we're in a medication crisis. There are many, many people who are taking 5 or more medications, all of which are interacting with each other in very, very bad ways. And these biological causes of forgetting are just terrible. So keep that in mind if you have a lot of forgetting. Could be something like that. Then thyroid conditions can be a huge thing. So to Ryan's point about physical factors, that would be a number one physical factor to consider. And, a lot of psychological conditions, one of the first things that they want to check is underperforming or hyperperforming thyroid situations. I don't know that much about it. I have a PhD, but I'm not a medical doctor, so don't take anything that we're saying today as medical advice. Get it checked out. But thyroid conditions can be huge. There may be oodles of other physical conditions. Ryan, if you're aware of any, please share in the chat so that we can add them to, future versions of what we're talking about today. Or I can do some more research about them. And there can be all kinds of physical things, such as lack of exercise. So really, you should be at the gym 3 times a week or in your own little gym that you build. Andres is here from Colombia. Excellent. Good to see you. Always happy to meet people from Colombia. I can't wait to visit there one of these days. And, build your own gym. It's as simple as push-ups in the park. Push-ups, squats. There's usually some kind of thing you can do some pull-ups with. Man, life is just nothing without those things. And even if you don't have arms or legs, I'm sure you can find something to do some physical fitness to get things flowing. All right, so there's a couple more biological causes of forgetting. Depression, this is a big one that I had. Can't focus on things. And if you can't focus on things, you're not going to get them into your memory in the first place, right? So that's pretty huge. Things like dementia, things like Alzheimer's. And then, of course, the kingpin of them all, which is often the source of all these biological problems, is diet. So we can go on and on and on about diet. When my next book is finally prepared, you will be delighted to see how I've gone through in detail how that I arrived at what are called rotation diets and elimination diets, and how I use them together in order to not only improve memory because of being able to pay attention better and focus better, but also remove pain. And I have very, very low instances of pain these days because of being able to really, really suss out what the heck was going on in my diet. We'll talk about diet a little bit more later today, and a simple exercise you can do to improve pretty much immediately both your memory and your diet in one blow. All right. So Month says, what about IQ? Well, what about it? There's different arguments about IQ all over the sun. What I have to say about it is that if you can memorize stuff, what do you need IQ for? I mean, there's no real barrier to using memory techniques. If anything, people with low IQ are probably better at memory techniques because they don't overthink it. They don't come up with all these endless excuses and some of the problems that we'll talk about in the behavioral section of today's presentation. But I'm no fan of IQ as an excuse for not being able to use memory techniques, because I doubt it. It's just highly unlikely. And if you're going to build quote unquote IQ, I don't know if you actually can do that, but who cares? Because there's so many people who are very, very successful in life who don't necessarily have this or that IQ. I know there's a lot of people who talk about it, and very controversially so, and yada, yada, yada. But at the end of the day, not interesting even remotely, although I may write about it in the future. But I don't see where you're going with it, and ultimately, I don't care. I don't care because it's a number. It's a metric that has been used for different kinds of testing, and where it's useful, so be it. Where it isn't useful is in most places where it's used, because most people don't understand that it is a metric that was invented, and it was invented in order to help people describe the world. And then the way that they've used those descriptions has been both positive and negative. And the one thing that I'll share, it wasn't really IQ, but there were performance tests that I was given as a kid in elementary school. And here's how that I operated on those tests. they were so boring that I just drew pictures in the circles. So I made little patterns and made little things like, you'd have a question and an A, B, C, D, E, or whatever, F, G, all these things. I would just get through it as soon as possible. I hated this. We did it every year. And then I remember after one of these tests, they weren't going to let me be in band class because I performed so poorly in these things. They said I had imagination deficit disorder, IDD, and they had all kinds of things that they told me. And I had to fight in order to be able to be allowed to play an instrument in band class. And I remember wanting to play saxophone, and they didn't think I had the intelligence for saxophone. And then I wanted to play bass guitar, and they said, well, we're not going to buy an amplifier for you to play bass guitar. And finally they said, probably, you're a smart enough guy to play trombone. And they implanted this seed in my head that I wasn't smart enough to figure out music because I never passed any of these tests. Well, the joke's on them, because even though I believed that story for a while, I never even tried to learn music because they told me I was so stupid that I'd never be able to learn music. So there was this kid beside me named Adam, and I used to just watch his slide, and I would just memorize where his slide was. And that's how I played music all through grade 6, just watching the dude slide and memorizing it. And I remember being at home and I would look at the sheet music and I'd just be playing what I memorized from this guy because I was told this story. Oh, you'll never memorize music. But then what happened in grade 7 is they gave us different trombone parts. Then I learned how to read music, and I learned how to read it real fast. And actually I was allowed to go to the summer school of music after grade 7 because I proceeded so quickly with music that I was allowed entry into this. And then they asked me to audition for and join the Rube band, which was with adults, and they would play on the ferry and go through there and whatever. I never actually did that. But Rob McLeod, who was in Canadian Brass, was one of my teachers at the summer school of music, and he took a shine to me or whatever, and I got some personal training from him, and somehow whatever. But that's the story. And then I wound up, playing in lots of bands and going on tour and stuff like this in my later life. And I was told that I couldn't do it because of these ridiculous tests. Nonsense. If a test is telling you anything, you just got to do it based on your own desire to do it and ignore the story. And I obviously ignored the story, even though I played along with it for a while. Oh, can't learn music? I'll learn it anyway. I'll learn it this way instead of that way. And then later, when it came to the time that I needed to, it was rather trivial. And I remember too competing in sight reading and doing quite well because they had these sight reading competitions. And that was a guy who didn't even believe that he could read music because he bought their little story from their silly little tests. So whatever. Bygones. Emotions certainly are involved in there, David. All right, so Scott says overriding memory. Sorry about my lack of reference. So I don't know what overriding memory could be, but we'll talk about something that relates to this in a minute here. If you're just joining us, hit that thumbs up. Let me know where you are in the world, what you're doing, what you're thinking. And DJ is here from Orlando. Oh, wow. I hope to visit Orlando one of these days. Sounds like a wonderful place and certainly looks like it. Very, very cinematic. All right. So we've talked about the biological causes of forgetting. Let's look at some of the behavioral ones. Because at the end of the day, people will take care of the biological as they please, if they please. And in terms of behavioral, these ones are the ones that require a bit of, dare I say, willpower, acts of will. So you have to, first of all, have in your frame of selection the ability to choose some of these things. And then you have to have the wherewithal to get yourself going. I highly recommend that you not wait for inspiration or motivation because they ain't coming. Just dive in and allow the exercises to create inspiration and motivation by just simply following the steps. Don't overthink it too much. So the solution to lack of memory exercise, which is the number one behavioral problem, is to get some memory exercise. Exercise your memory. So how exactly do you exercise your memory? Well, we'll talk about that, but let's catch up with Andre's comment here. He says there are different types of intelligence and how we can measure if we are all different. I subscribed the other day. I saw your video of reading actual books rather than digital. Love it. Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us. Thanks for checking out that video. And yeah, if you missed that, there's quite a popular video I did on why I read physical books only instead of digital. And I'm sticking to that because it's so much better to read physical books. Although I did have a period where I did read a lot of digital books, and what a waste. There's so much more. And it's not just, the physical reading, but also physical production. So this is the mind map of my upcoming course that is getting close to completion. And the course is so much better because of having made it physical, and so many more powerful avenues for exploration came out of the physicality of it. Multiple colors, lots of space to work with. Yeah. So there's an interesting book you should read called The Revenge of Analog, which is talking a lot about the return to physical because of so much hunger that our diving into digital with such depth has created. There's just a lack of connection to the information. That said, there's certainly lots of benefits to the digital, so we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But in any case, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Lack of memory exercise. Why do people not do it? Well, a lot of people don't know that you can exercise your memory, for one thing, and a lot of people don't know how to exercise their memory. And really, in my view, there's not a whole lot of benefit from any of the apps that I've seen out there. And I don't think there's any coming because of this point that Andres raised with the difference between the digital and the physical. So what we need to think about is, how can we exercise our memory in the most physical ways possible that actually have something to do with the world? And by the way, I've been thinking a lot about the virtual memory palace problem, and there's some things coming that I'm going to share all about the virtual memory palace, because some of the biggest innovators about it have said have created some very, very compelling arguments that lend steam to my argument that there's no need for an app for memory palaces, and they themselves are some of the biggest innovators. Now, they're not mentioning memory palaces per se, but their arguments are so compelling, and I just want to prepare that as a proper presentation for you all. And whether you agree with it or not is up to you. But I don't know if Adolfo's still here, but he certainly went through some experiences that also lend credence and steam to that. And it's not to say that there isn't an app coming, but it's just very unlikely, given the nature of how the human brain works, how memory works within it, and how these apps work. And they don't really exercise your memory in the way that they promise, even if there is some memory exercise. Scott says apps are crap. Well, again, I'm not entirely willing to write them off, but at the end of the day, what we need to consider is that there are going to be people in the world who are going to have the most extraordinary brains that are healthy and vivid and vibrant in old age, and they're going to be the ones who are willing to treat that brain in a particular way. And the people who are suffering really, really badly and heavily are going to be the ones who didn't. And so the truth will be told in time. But how exactly you exercise your memory, there's a couple of ways that are the most direct, the most powerful, and lend themselves to your memory practice. And keep in mind that the ultimate memory exercise is to simply sit down and memorize things using memory techniques. Very, very, very important. So creating a memory palace network is a very, very powerful memory exercise, and it will exercise your brain. Why? Because it's going to tap into, first of all, well, I mean, there's no hierarchy here, but it's going to tap into many levels of memory, and one of those is going to be your autobiographical memory and your spatial memory at the same time. It's where those two things meet. So David asked, and I gave an exercise. Well, all those birthday parties that I said, they took place somewhere, right? And so all of them are spatial and autobiographical. And when I think of that Kiss album, I was thinking in my mind, the living room where I opened that birthday present. I was thinking of the bedroom where I listened to that cassette over and over and over again. And both of those are now, very powerful memory palaces. and all the more so because they have these profound emotions attached to them. Not only that, but I can think of the restaurant where we went before the birthday party gifts were opened, and so on. And then that restaurant, I can think about what's around that restaurant, etc. So Memory Palace network development is a huge memory exercise that taps into multiple levels of memory. And of course, if you do the recommendation that I teach of drawing them out, then you're also looking into your figural memory as you look into your spatial memory and your autobiographical memory. If you think of who was there and when and some of the stories you have around them, then you have episodic memory and so on. So Chad gave me that cassette, If Memory Serves, and then I got whole long stories about Chad. I remember all kinds of things about him, and those are all exercising different levels of memory. So it's a huge memory exercise, and the best thing is that it's physical in nature as opposed to digital, because you're just doing it inside of your mind in places that you physically were, with people that you physically spent time with, and they physically, so to speak, live in your brain chemistry because they're encoded in the actual material cells. That's very, very interesting to think about, but it's also more than interesting. It's beneficial to play around with, to develop, to revisit again and again and again. All right, so barreling forward, another major memory exercise is to learn to use a major system. So you're going to memorize some stuff in order to do this. Very, very small set of information. It's a huge memory exercise just to do that. And then if you want to take it further, you can develop a 00 to 99. And another powerful memory exercise is to develop yourself an alphabet list. So we know that not having memory exercise is a real problem. It's a behavioral issue. And so we need to start to get some memory exercise. These are the most direct ways. Some other people may need to find some other direct ways, but all of these are very, very powerful. They tap into all kinds of levels of memory, echoic memory, semantic memory. Oh man, you could just create an endless list of all kinds of cool science words, and you could memorize those too for even more memory exercise and practice. DJ says, in college, they have a lot of online classes and books. I find it hard to study, so I've always invested in the physical books. Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for that point. I don't know what to do about it, but I'm sure glad that I went to university before that all happened, because not only do you have the problems of digital amnesia and the poor retention that we're seeing from digital books, but you also have the problem that those books live where? They live on devices that are built to interrupt, right? And no one should feel badly about this, because it happens to all of us, even the most disciplined people. You are hooked by dopamine spikes and addicted to the interruptions themselves. The notifications cause you to crave notification, so that you just then go, oh, better go on over here and check. You're not, you're just like the rat pushing the pellet, I wonder if there's going to be a pellet, because your brain, not just you as a person, there's no personal weakness in this. It happens to everybody. You're just hooked. And so now your scholarly material is living inside of the device that has wired you to crave interruption. It's a recipe for failure. It's a recipe for failure. And people wonder that all these students are being so easily indoctrinated. Of course they're being easily indoctrinated. They can't even pay attention. And the things to which they're indoctrinated are the most specious, dramatic, laden, la-di-da utopian theories that themselves have addictive elements inside of them. So it's a big problem. And one of the best solutions is physical books back locked up in rooms where all you can do is read them. Simple solution. Get rid of the interruptions and practice your attention span. And it's not that easy. And it's harder these days to practice attention span because of how that we're looped to these machines. But digital fasting is fast. It's fun. It's easy. It's a bit of a stretch, but I try to do it at least 1 week, whole day away, no devices whatsoever. And then even inside of digital fasting, you can take content fasts. So I myself have had to impose a content fast and just stay away from a certain topic that got me deep into its loophole. again. But once you're out of it, it's just, wow, what the heck was I doing spending so much time in there? But then there's also this kind of thing of like imposed ignorance. Do you want to be ignorant of the world? Well, not forever. But then can you create frameworks that help you dip in from time to time so that you're not lost in ignorance, but you're not caught in the loopholes either? The algorithms make that very, very difficult, but it is possible. That's a topic for a different day, but great point, DJ. Thanks for sharing that. And really, the discerning student will make a special effort to get the physical versions of the textbooks. And here's the thing. A lot of textbooks are updated, and you may find that your teacher insists on like the 12th edition or whatever. Don't necessarily buy into the fact that you need to read the 12th edition. If you can find the 11th edition and work with that, then you can often just go to a library or to a friend and just compare the 12th edition and so forth and see what might be updated and still survive quite well with the previous edition. I did that a lot back in the day, and I didn't buy their stories that it needed to be this or that edition, because here's a little known fact from my back end life as a former professor. They would want you to do that. They would say, make sure that you're getting the students to get the 12th edition, not the 11th, because the publishers have a bit of a bit of an agenda. Oh, yes, they do. All right. And they have deals with campus bookstores as well. So that's something to keep in mind. Eidetic memory too. I'm not sure where you're going with that, Scott, but thank you very, very much for that. Please say more. Adolfo says, I've been forcing myself to focus on pillar stations. It's been chalked, but it finally clicked. Yesterday, I created a pillar memory palace with 120 stations in under 45 minutes. Boom! That is boom indeed. Awesome. Thanks for letting us know about that, Adolfo. Yeah, the pillar technique is the real deal once you get into it. Amazing. So 120 stations. That's huge. Wonderful. Very, very good. Cool. Cool beans, as one of my friends likes to say. I love that. Cool beans. All right. So we've got a couple of behavioral things going on here, and this is really just scratching the surface. So lack of memory exercise is one of the biggest ones. The next one, and I see this so often, it's unbelievable, and that's negative stories. I can't believe the amount of negative stories that people tell themselves all the time. And you know what? What's so bad about it is that they tell two kinds of negative stories. So they tell the negative stories to themselves, or you tell it to yourself potentially, and then they go on and they tell it to others. What a double whammy of negativity. It's unbelievable. And so there's something called learned helplessness, right? Which is, oh, I can't do this, or I don't know, and blah, 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 and all this whining and crying and sob stories. And, believe me, I've done it to myself too. So I'm not coming from a high horse here. I've had to weed this crap out of my own life. And it's so insidious, and how rapidly it can come back is unbelievable. But it's like water and weed and repeat, Water, weed, and repeat. It's just like a garden. Life is like a garden in many, many ways. But these negative stories, they create learned helplessness. And then there's enforced helplessness, because you tell the stories to others and they've learned your story of helplessness, and then they repeat it back to you, and then you have it as well. So this is really, really tragic. I used to have this problem with harm OCD and would tell people, I'd not only tell the story to myself again and again and again about how bad I was with bridges, right? But I'd tell other people about it, and then they would start to help me avoid bridges. So not only was it learned helplessness around bridges, but then it was enforced helplessness, because they would help me reinforce the story. Bad, 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 bad. It just makes it worse, right? And people do this with their memory all the time, because they'll say to their family, oh, well, I have such a bad memory, I'm forgetting all the time. And now that story that they've told to themselves, they tell to others. And then their wife says, well, Henry, you've got such a bad memory, and that's why, and blah, 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 right? And it just goes on and on and on, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. So how do you get out of it? Well, you got to tell a better story, right? And it's pretty easy to do if you're just willing to make a simple change. And it's a very easy change, right? So instead of saying, oh, my memory is so bad, I've seen on live streams people actually do this so bad. They put so many O's behind there to really make sure that that story that you want to tell yourself and others gets through so bad. Instead of saying crap like that, how about say I'm just someone who works on exercising my memory, right? So you forget somebody's name and you don't feel bad about it. You just say, oh, I'm working on my memory. Make that O long enough that you can catch yourself and then tell a different story. So, and look, I've forgotten names as well in my day. And sometimes when I'm doing different meetings and so forth, where I'm not there to talk about memory, talking about something else, I may not do recall rehearsal for whatever reason. And then I'll think, oh my God. And I just have to fess up and say, you know, I work on my memory so much, but in this case, didn't get it, didn't do the work. So what was your name? And now I'm going to share with you what I'm going to do to remember it properly. So, you know, this happens from time to time. And it's not that fun, but here's the thing. If you will just fess up and then and put a better story around it, no, people will think much higher of you than if you go around and be like, yeah, I've got all these memory laurels and blah, blah, blah. And it's happened even with memory competitors. Very famous situation where one of them won a competition and then the next day they're on TV and the host, you know, they forgot the name of the host that they were on the show with. So that person, I'm sure, went and remembered that host's name after that and used the techniques. I don't know if or if not, but it's a very, very important thing is that if you start, if that competitor went and then started to tell a negative story, then that obviously could take root. They start telling it to the others. And even as someone who had won such a huge competition, that story could work its way in and cause all kinds of terrible things for the rest of life. But if they take it in stride and say, well, I'm just continually working on things and I allow the situation to be the lesson that helps me to do better, then you'll think, well, oh, that guy's name, it was Paul, because you now are remembering it. I'm actually I'm actually thinking of that name and putting it into use so that I'm much more sure to remember it. It doesn't happen to be that often, but it does happen from time to time. And it's an opportunity to tell a story, a negative one. But the point is, it's also an opportunity to tell a better story. So be on guard for these negative stories. Know that they can return, even if you've replaced them with better ones, and always be prepared to have a better story. This is huge behavioral thing. Adolfo says, guys, don't waste your cash on VR. I wasted close to $2,000 on VR software and hardware for virtual Memory Palace creation. Waste of cash. Nothing beats sketching out a Memory Palace and recall rehearsal. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Adolfo. And need to really hear more for the piece that I'm putting together. I think you're going to love the reasons that I've discovered from VR experts themselves, why that this is even more true. I've been thinking a lot about that, and something just caught my eye, and that'll be coming on a live stream soon. DJ makes the point that embarrassment is memorable. Yeah, it is. But we don't want to turn a story around that, or spin a story around it that catches hold. We want to just take embarrassment for what it is. And you know, it's also possible to just willfully not be embarrassed when you've slipped up or made a mistake or not taken an opportunity that you could have. It's just being honest can replace embarrassment. Radical honesty is a huge thing that I've realized in life. I mean, I'm known as Memory Guy. I was invited to go talk about something, and it had nothing to do with memory whatsoever. And I memorized half the name, but I wasn't thinking about the memory stuff at all. And I placed myself in the room in the wrong position. So I was sat beside somebody who blocked an entire side of the table as they were all doing their introductions. And then I missed one name, then I missed another name, and then at the end I was just like, I missed all these names. So there was nothing I could really do. And if I had been paying more attention, I would have sat myself on another side of the table, because I'm 80% deaf in this ear. And so I really need to have this ear facing as much of the room possible if I'm going to do the trick, do the stunt. And what ended up happening is one of the people at the meeting whose name I remember because I know her, but she's always pretty impressed by this display of recalling all the names, said, "Do the trick" at the end after my presentation. And I was just kind of not thinking about it, not whatever. And I just said, look, I actually didn't hear most of these names. And I kind of wish I would have said this, but I didn't even think of it at the time. But also, they all had their names on these tags or on these, whatever you call this, little forms, very nicely displayed in big fat letters. What I could have done is just said all their names and just read off of the sheets. Could have done this thing, and you were, whatever. And I wish what I would have said is, by the way, if some guy sits there and tells you all your names with your names on display right in front of him, that guy's a total fraud. I didn't say that, but the whole point being is I called a spade a spade. It was like, I didn't hear half your names, and I didn't bother like doing this thing where, well, I heard half your names, and so you were Graham, or you were Benjamin, rather. There was a Benjamin there, and you were Bill, and you were Alan, and you were Rose. And by the way, you were Rose. I didn't do this, and I chose not to do it because it would be, in a way, putting off, I think, half the people's names, because it's almost like saying, well, you guys were really important, but you guys weren't important enough for me to move. Anyway, there's no perfect answer to it, but it's not my embarrassment in the moment that I'll remember, because I wasn't embarrassed. Rather, I'm more proud of just calling a spade, and then I tied it into the nature of my presentation. And part of the nature of my presentation, it worked really nicely. Everybody laughed, and I'm sure that they've all forgotten about it anyway. And the cool thing is I do remember half the names there, and if I meet those people again, I'll just greet them by name. And so it'll be, and it'll just be one of those stories to tell. So don't tell a bad story about it whatsoever. Just focus on the positive. And I now turn that situation as a reminder to myself, well, just in case, sit in the place where you can hear. Remember, if your left ear is pointing at half the room, you're going to miss most of those names. And so you got to sit in a perfect place. This has happened a lot with my deafness. I've heard a Graham, or I've called a guy William who was a Graham, and, just explain. So, never be embarrassed. Just be a person who works on your memory. Tell a better story. Now, the next behavioral point that is so important to get this out of your life if you do it to yourself is putting too much pressure on the outcome. People put so much pressure on the outcome that they actually interfere with their ability to learn and use the techniques. And this happens in all kinds of areas of life. And it's such a huge thing in memory that there's actually a name for it in memory science, and that is interference theory. So the task at hand becomes impossible to focus on due to a concern about the things to come. So it's not just a memory technique issue, but it's also a learning thing. So people will say, oh, I've got 15 books to memorize, and to read, let's say. They're so focused on the fact that there are 15 books, their brain is interfered by that fact that they can't even focus on one of them. Even though it doesn't matter if it's one book or 4,563. They're going to need to focus on them one at a time, no matter how many there are. Even if there's two, you still have to focus on them one at a time, right? So interference theory tells us that we make it impossible to focus on the task at hand because we're overly concerned about what is to come. So you can look up interference theory in memory and read more about it. And there's more finesse to what this interference theory is all about. But I find over the years that this is one of the number one things that trips people up, and it's a behavioral thing because it's a mindset thing in the mind, that people focus on so many things that they're not even prepared to deal with yet because they're not even worried, they're not even focused about the one thing that's sitting right in front of them. They're putting not just one cart ahead of the horse, they're putting 5,093 carts ahead of the horse. So the solution is to let go of the outcome. And there's an example I want to give that I think will really, really give us some clues about how to do this. And then we'll talk about a practical technique that will help you arrange that for yourself. But if you're just joining us, hit the thumbs up. Let me know where you are in the world, what you're doing, what you're thinking. And before that we get into this very, very interesting example, we'll have a little pause for this quick inspirational memory demonstration and message.
384626 4338 3279 5028 84 1971 69 399375.
Hi, my name is Paul, and I've taken a few courses by Anthony Metivier, but I felt that the experience of doing it today live was the biggest advantage. Anthony has a gift in simplifying complex concepts, and I feel that I've really come away today with practical skills that I can now use effectively. It was great to immerse ourselves in the situation, to be able to apply the time, because when we're at home we may not take the time to do the memory exercises that we were doing today. I felt particularly that the thing that we did at the end of today was something that is totally unique in memory training, which is 3 days of memory, which is how to practice your skills. I've read many memory books and I've never come across a system laid out as to how to practice what you've learned, and this is what I gained today from Anthony's course. So I give it 10 out of 10. Thank you.
5342 1170 679.
All right, so William is here. Good to see you, William. Thanks for being here. And, really appreciate when people send videos of what they're up to and what they're doing. And one of the coolest things is those videos, seeing all of you. So if you've had any interesting results whatsoever, always appreciate a testimonial or a video testimonial in order to be able to show others what the impact that this art and science and craft of memory improvement can do, just to have wonderful experiences in life at the end of the day, in addition to being able to memorize whatever it is that you want to memorize. So very thankful to Paul for that, and would love to see some more from you all. And actually, we just got another one yesterday, came in, and it's absolutely fantastic, showing another sort of approach to using the memory palace as well. So that's kind of cool, because innovation happens when people use these techniques. All right. So I said that there's an example of someone, or an example that gives clues about how to let go of the outcome. And I really like this email I received once upon a time from James Gerwing. And this is the actual email. This is from quite some years ago, but James Gerwing wrote, and he said, "Here I am seated below my arbiters after memorizing 29 and then 34 shuffle cards at 5 minutes each. The first try beat the existing provincial record. The second try bested that. Would not have done it without your impetus. I am registered to compete in the Canadian Championships in Montreal. Thanks, Anthony." So that's from James Gerwing, who signs off as Jim. And the clues here that are so important, and by the way, if you haven't hit the thumbs up yet, hit it now for James and this wonderful accomplishment. And the clues here that have to do with letting go of the outcome is, notice this use of the word try, right? It's just like, my first try broke this record, and my second try broke that one again. So that's 2 records broken, right? And this word try there is very, very interesting. Now, we can get into the Yoda stuff and be like, well, do or do not, there is no try. But at the end of the day, that's only useful to a certain degree, because what we need to really consider here is that everything is a try. Everything is an attempt. Every time that you sit down and use memory techniques, you're making a try at it, right? And it is doing. Trying is doing at some level. And not only that, but one of the things that you want to think about, and I don't think I've stressed it nearly enough, but every magnetic image you create is a first draft of that image. It doesn't necessarily need to work the first time. And sometimes it won't. You go back and you fix it. You go back and work with it. You ask questions like, why did this not work? Instead of deciding, telling some story about, it not working, you just go back and analyze and then see if you can improve the result and see what you can learn from it. So, I learn all the time from doing this. And it's not just the images you create, but what can you learn from when you make a behavioral mistake in not using the techniques at all and not using them totally. So, talked a lot about this already today, but it's very, very important for your progress is to see everything as a try and be willing to have first draft magnetic imagery that you then go back and improve and learn a lot about the technique itself through the improvement process. And then there's another thing that essentially I heard most strongly, but I've heard it many, many times from other people, and that was Ben Pridmore talking about faith. So there's a great Ron White video where he interviews Ben Pridmore, and he says really the ultimate thing that helped him win was being willing to have faith in his memory, right? And that's letting go of the outcome. So imagine you want to win this competition, and you're just so focused on your desire to win that you're putting so much stress and pressure on everything that it just blows your game. But if you're just relaxed, let go of the outcome, have faith that your memory is going to work because you're practiced with the techniques and the skills, then you have the joy of being in the moment, competing or whatever it is, and just let it go. And so that's a very, very good point. And, if you can't take it from me, take it from many memory competitors who have put it that way. They've won some, they've lost some, and really the art of the game is just to let go of that outcome. And the whole skill really, if you dive deep into its core, is to be able to focus on the task at hand only by being in the zone, not being on the 45 different things that come after this, not being on the one thing that comes after this, not being on the life before, right? Which is this interference theory as well. Sometimes you think about the past. You've got to just be with that thing. And so this is very, very important to understand, because if you want to let go of the outcome, you have to have different behaviors. And how I recommend that people do this above all things, in addition to memory practice, of course, and you can bring the two together, is meditation. So we'll talk about meditation in a minute, and I'll give you 3 ways to meditate for better memory. But let's check in with our chat. If you're just joining us, hit the thumbs up. Let me know where you are in the world, what you're doing, what you're thinking. 333 is here. Well, that's a very memorable name. I like that. 333. David says, I have my 26 A to Z memory palaces and using it to memorize Arabic. I would guess you have several hundred memory palaces. Do you have a master palace that reminds you of the various subjects you have memorized? No, and that's a great question, but I don't need a master palace. Look, if you need something to remind you of what you've memorized, then something's gone wrong along the way. You shouldn't need this sort of thing. I don't think, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have one if you want to explore that. But I know how a master palace could work, and I've played around with it and talked about it before and so forth, but it just is a losing gambit at the end of the day due to the nature of the rhizomatic effect that we talk about in the master plan. So this is like what it could look like, and you'll see how quickly that this could impede itself very, very rapidly, is imagine something like Grand Central Station, and in Grand Central Station there's a corridor, and along that corridor there is a series of doors. Let's say there's 26 doors. There's the A door, the B door, the C door, the D door, etc., all the way up to Z. So that's one corridor. And then in another corridor you have all this sort of stuff. Well, really, what the heck do you need that corridor for when A to Z, those memory palaces, is already an implicit corridor, right? It just doesn't have a corridor in which it sits, but it's A to Z. And if you memorize things like you use memory techniques for Foucault Book 1, Foucault Book 2, Foucault Book 3, whatever, then really, do you then need a corridor that's going to have 3 F doors? Or do you just remember that Discipline and Punish is not the same book as Birth of the Clinic, or The Order of Things? Speaking of ordering things, he has a book with that title. you just spend all this time endlessly revising a master memory palace. In my experience, it's just not necessary. But if you would like to do that, by all means. There's nothing against it, but I just don't see it as being all that useful. And if you wanted to use it for long-term rehearsal and remembering what you worked on, my only pushback on that is, why would you need to remember what you worked on when the whole point is to use these techniques to not forget what you worked on? Like, why would that be that case? And here's what I would suggest doing instead. Why not live a life that draws upon what it is that you worked on? So we have these chats on these live streams, and I just constantly withdraw from the bank account of what I memorized from my PhD years. I don't teach at a university anymore, but I continually am able to draw upon that, either with direct reference or implicit reference that nobody knows I'm really making, and go deep into that to speak very specifically about it. We were on the last live stream about eternal bliss. We were deep into the Nietzsche, and I'm just going directly to that, not like, hey, by the way, in this in Nietzsche Memory Palace number 4, etc. And I don't even need to go to the Memory Palace because I just know that stuff because of having worked with it. I was lucky because I had Fred Alfers as one of my professors, and he's one of the biggest world scholars of Nietzsche that the scholarship market has. And so that was cool in being able to direct my course of study in a particular direction that it wouldn't have gone with Nietzsche otherwise. But at the end of the day, the bigger thing is that I just live a life that constantly reminds me of what it was that I worked on. And to go through and remind myself of all that stuff artificially, so to speak, seems to be an evasion of just living the life that uses it. And that may not be right for you, but that's definitely right for me. And it then just leaves time open for other avenues of things to memorize, such as my main focus, which is just memorizing Sanskrit and learning Chinese at the moment. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it is my take on that. And so do with that as you will. But I think at the end of the day, I imagine most people would prefer to live a life based on the knowledge that they've acquired, as opposed to reminding themselves of what they acquired. But I don't know. Pat is here checking in from the Golden Triangle. Lots of broad spectrum wisdom being offered here today. Excellent, Pat. Thanks for being here. Thanks for saying hello. If you're here and joining us, hit the thumbs up. Let me know where you are in the world, what you're doing, what you're thinking. And let's talk about the behavior that will correct so many of these problems. There's really 3 ways to meditate for better memory that we're going to talk about today. I'm sure that there are an infinite number of ways to meditate for better memory, but this is a behavior that will help deal with so many of the other behaviors, such as not practicing, such as telling yourself negative stories, and so forth. And then it'll help with some of the more technical things that we'll talk about in a minute that are so important for using the memory techniques themselves. So the first is just to sit. Don't have a goal. All your goal is to sit just to sit. Set a timer for 8 minutes, or pick a time where you just, pick a number. And if you think you can do 10 minutes, set it for 8. I always liked that suggestion from Tim Ferriss, and I use it a lot. When I do this, I don't do it that much anymore, but when I need to set a timer, I always just think, well, I can do this for 10 minutes, so I'll set it for 8. And then when you sit just to sit, literally that's all you're doing. Don't have any other goal other than you're just going to sit there and see what happens. Keep a journal. Do this for some time. You'll find that all kinds of interesting things happen, and those things are very, very useful for your practice. And if you will do this just 4 times a week, there is good scientific data that shows that this in itself will give you a memory boost. It'll give you a lot of other boosts as well, such as training your memory and your brain to pay attention, to focus, to concentrate, etc. And what are you concentrating on? Sitting just to sit. That's it. The next thing is to explore memory palaces. So in a meditation, you could explore memory palaces. What's one of the best ways to do this? Well, have a memory palace network created and then just go through them. How can you go through them without having undue mental pressure? Oh, what was my memory palace? the alphabet. So what's your A memory palace? What's your B memory palace? What's your C memory palace, etc.? I always laugh at the people who poo-poo this idea of having an alphabetical memory palace network. It's so beneficial. It reduces so much cognitive overload. And maybe David's right. Maybe you do need a key if you want to be able to do this kind of exercise, because then you'd be like, well, I got many A memory palaces. How am I going to organize all those? So maybe you need a key, an alphabet-based key for the different networks that you have that just help you separate out all the A's from the B's and the C's and the D's, etc. You can also number your networks. So you could have a 0-1 palace, a 0-2, a 0-3, a 0-0 palace for that matter, etc. The whole point is you sit and you meditate, maybe for 10 minutes, maybe for 8 minutes, whatever the case is, and you start with A, and you don't stop meditating until that you've named all the ones up until Z. Or maybe you just need to do half the alphabet. Maybe you just need to do 2 or 3. It's up to you. You could just get a die, and maybe two, and roll them and say, okay, so the number here is 12. I'm going to go through 12, and you go through them with as much depth as you want, which can include the recall rehearsal tools. So that's a second way of meditating for better memory. What is this going to do? It's going to exercise your autobiographical memory, your spatial memory, etc., all those levels of memory. And then the third thing I would suggest is actually meditate to recite. So this is what I've been doing for 2.5 years now. Haven't missed a day, sitting, reciting, and it gets longer and longer and longer, and it's very, very exciting to just sit and be able to do this. Memorize a bit more, then recite, and it's mind-blown kind of stuff. Can't believe all the wonderful things that have been happening because of this, and I see no sign of stopping. I don't have any interest whatsoever in, any kind of record setting like some memory people do, and that's just part of the world, but I'm just doing it because it's awesome. And maybe one day in the future I will sit or I will look up what's the Guinness World Record for memorized Sanskrit, and then I'll say, well, maybe I will sit for that. I doubt it though. I don't see any particular benefit for doing that. But nonetheless, it's a very, very good thing. So memorize and recite. Do you have to memorize some sort of scripture? No, you can memorize song lyrics and play them through in your mind. Sitting and singing switches on so many healing chemicals, and you can do that with any song. I'm sure that your brain doesn't know if it's a spiritual song or if it's Johnny Cash. Like, it may know if you're going to sing Trent Reznor's "Hurt," it may not give you exactly the mood benefits that you would get from some uplifting, cheerful song. So, pick your music well if you're going to do this with song lyrics. But at the end of the day, I don't think that there's that much difference. So it could be a poetic piece like My House or something by Lou Reed, which is a very beautiful poem, really, to memorize and to work with. All right. Now, meditation, why is it so useful? Well, it's useful for all of the things that we're talking about in terms of habit formation and so forth, but it's also very, very useful for what's called proactive interference. So I told you there are some ins and outs about interference theory of memory, and one of the things is proactive interference. And this is proactive because it's drawing upon things that you already know, right? So there are old ways of learning that you have where you're so used to rote learning, let's say, that it's very, very hard to change to magnetic learning, so to speak. Or you may have old memories. And so sometimes people will have these old memories that interfere, like they might have a negative family figure, or maybe it's just a really bad memory palace. Like, I don't use any of the foster homes that I was in because they're just not, they're not on the up and up in my memory, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so why invite proactive interference? But there's other times where it can be kind of healing. So there are some places that I've actually turned around, so to speak, healed a little bit, but had to pay the price of a little bit of what in memory science they would call proactive interference. So it can be that old learning habits, and like an example of old ways of learning in proactive interference can be with the guitar, right? So I often use the example of how when my picking arm, often my shoulder will go up. And that's a proactive interference because I've learned that my shoulder has to go down, and I just remind myself to get the shoulder down. But it's so ingrained. It's the same thing with Maricela, who is in the masterclass in the mastermind and often joins us on these live streams. Because I never heard her pronounce that name and I just didn't know that it's actually Maricela, it's so ingrained, the pronunciation I was using before, that that's an example of proactive interference. And one of the things that, you've got to do is just figure out strategies for dealing with that. And meditation is useful for that. And it's useful in two ways. It makes you mindful of the mistake about to come, and it makes you mindful not to tell a bad story about yourself when you do make the mistake, and then you can correct it over time. So that's a very, very powerful use of meditation. And there's many, many other uses. Mr. Space is in the house. Good to see you, Mr. Space, as always. If memory serves, you're out in Queens. Ryan says, are you saying, so I understand it's create mind palace. Each mind palace is associated with the alphabet. Therefore, you have 26 mind palaces. That is the start. Yeah. I would, and there's more than just the organizational benefit to it. The alphabet is generative. It's organizational. And another very powerful element of it is that it's reproducible. So you don't have to have just one set. You can have multiple alphabets. You can also have an alphabet list for imagery, and there's a lot of benefits to the alphabet. And it just reduces cognitive load across the board. So it's associative, it's generative, it's organizational, it's reproducible. Oh, and I'm sure there's other things that just aren't coming to mind right now. The other thing is that it's also multilinguistic, right? So there's an English alphabet, there's a German alphabet, there's an Italian alphabet, fewer letters, but there you go. There's a Cyrillic alphabet, and so on. In some senses, there's even a Pinyin alphabet because some of those letters are pronounced differently in Pinyin. Oh, so many possibilities. Wonderful, wonderful. All right, so that's another behavioral problem that we can solve. We can solve all the negative storytelling. We can solve all kinds of problems just by meditating, and meditating in the three ways that we talked about today. What's another behavioral cause of forgetting? Chrome Woman Walking is in the house. Good to see you. Wonderful, wonderful. Hope that you are having a great weekend. I guess it's still the weekend for most of the world. Always good to see you. And yeah, how have you been? Let us know. The next cause of forgetting in the behavioral category is not paying attention. Not paying attention. And there's a lot of reasons why people wouldn't pay attention. So, for example, not paying attention can happen because you're in physical pain. And that's one of the things that used to happen to me a lot. And so I'm glad that I've been able to reduce pain to very, very small amounts to almost non-existent most of the time, which is amazing. And meditation, that's another thing meditation can help with, actually, because you begin to learn that you're not your body in the way that you think you are. And so there's a hell that is produced by associating with your body. Yeah, Mr. Space, Spider-Man and Batman. How are these universes coexisting in my memory palace? Maybe one day the intellectual property sellers will make another licensing agreement so that they can play together nicely. All right. So not paying attention, right? Pain can get in the way of not paying attention. But let's just take a typical example of memorizing names, right? Or details in conversations. One of the big reasons why that people don't memorize names is because they're thinking about what they will say next, right? So that's a real problem. And one of the things that you can do to prevent yourself from thinking about what you will say next is to repeat what they are saying silently in your mind. Not necessarily their name. I mean, you should be able to get to the level relatively quickly of hearing a name, memorizing it, and then putting it into sufficient recall rehearsal to get it into midterm, long-term memory right away. But in terms of, the actual conversation, they might say, well, my name is Bill and I work in IT and yada, yada, yada. And you're already thinking, oh, well, that's my cue to say what I work on and I'm going to say it in this particular way. That just completely is interference, but it's also replacement. So your brain may have heard it. It may have gone into some level of memory, but it never got encoded because you weren't paying attention. And maybe it did get encoded and it'll come back to you later if it's a very simple name, but that's not when you need it. You need it right away, and you need it so that you can get it into long-term memory. There's a lot of conditional things that go on with names, but attention is huge. And so one thing that I've found to help my brain focus is to repeat what people are saying. So, and I don't mean repeat like again and again and again, but if Bill says I'm in IT, I will say IT, in my mind silently, and maybe have a you-directed, focused question that I want to ask so that I'm still focused on him instead of whatever's coming out. Because look, I know myself very well, as most of you know yourselves very well. You don't really have to sit there and think about what you want to say next. You'll be able to generate it without some massive dress rehearsal in your mind. You can literally just focus on people, and one of the ways to do it is repeat what they're saying in their mind and then come up with questions so that you can do more. Oh, IT. So how did you get into that? When did you start with that? What's involved in that? And just go through the, who, what, where, when, why, how, and for how long sort of stuff, right? That's very, very powerful. So Crone Woman is having a good weekend. Attention is the mother of memory. Indeed it is. It is not only the mother, but the father and the heavens above in many, many respects. All right, so another thing that you can do, and I don't know if William is still here, but he and I shot a video about this, is use the fist. Right? So one of the things that helps us retain memory is to put a physical tie to it. So that old thing about tying something around a string around your finger? That actually has some neurochemical basis because you're actually linking some mental content with a kinesthetic sense of touch, right? But you don't have to tie a finger to your string. You can a string to your finger. You can literally just hold a fist. That can help a great deal. If you did want to hold on to something that someone else is saying, or even hold on to what you wanted to say, like if you didn't want to forget a point that you were going to make in a conversation, like you wanted to add a detail or whatever, you can continue to pay attention to that person and link it to a fist. And you can actually add magnetic imagery to your own hand. So let's say you wanted to make a point about Napoleon or something. You can put a giant Napoleon hand on your fist, and you don't have to hold your fist out in the world. You can put it on your lap or whatever and just hold that and then continue to pay attention. You might want to exaggerate that Napoleon hat so it's not a bland Napoleon hat, but it's a Napoleon hat made out of acid that's burning into your hand and whatever. Something really, really extraordinary so that you remember it. And that's a very powerful technique. So William and I, we have a whole video where we go through this. You can check it out in the channel. It's called The Fist. And you'll find it very, very useful. So Chroma One Walking says, today I greeted a dying family member by his first name and he beamed and said, you have a really good memory. Awesome, awesome. I won't clap too loud for those ears out there that are sensitive, but amazing, wonderful. And that's like a perfect example, right? Where using these techniques in real life, everyday situation is so powerful for connecting with people at a deeply professional level, and surely in a moment of sorrow, adding just something that is uniquely human and really may not make this surface level difference, but deep down is probably such a wonderful experience for that person. So wonderful, wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, and thanks for doing that above all. So Mr. Space says, great advice as always. Well, thank you for saying so, and it's even greater when it's put into action. Month says, can you explain to me what is the benefit of having 26 memory palaces associated with the alphabet? Well, the first benefit is having 26 memory palaces, which may not be obvious to you. But if you have one memory palace, you don't really know the technique. You'll never be able to explore it in enough depth to get good with spatial memory. And you certainly won't have enough for 260 words, for example, because if you have 10 memory palace or 10 magnetic stations in each memory palace, then you can have that many words. And by the time that you do that, you'll be so well versed with these techniques that you'll be able to memorize anything under the sun. And very, very important. So that's one benefit. is that you have enough spatial memory to work with. And then in terms of being able to segment and organize your progress through any topic, you have some segmentation that logically distinguishes the memory palaces from each other. So if it's vocabulary, you have 10 words that are already associated with each other because they're all similar. And if you use bridging figures, you can do so in an even more zeroed in or zoned in, laser focused way. Zeroed in, yeah, I think we say that sometimes in English, don't we? And this is really, really impactful. Now, it's a bit counterintuitive, and it can cause you to stretch in the beginning. But if you work with it, you'll find that it's very, very powerful. And then another thing is you have ways of associating the alphabet all over the place. So, your Foucault memory palaces, as I used in university, boom, 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 boom. Just everybody's name is alphabetical. And there are many, many other uses beyond that. So let me know if you have more questions about that, but those are a couple of the huge benefits. And never underestimate the fact that mastery comes from repetition at some level and repeating in different locations. So it's well known that familiarity with people, we're much more familiar with people if we see them in more locations. That's why advertising, for example, often has somebody at the beach, then they're in the bar, then they're at the office, then they're over here, then they're over there. And it's because it makes us more familiar with the topic at hand or the person at hand or the brand at hand. I don't know why this is neurochemically, but it may have something to do with the production of norepinephrine in the brain, which is a chemical related to novel situations that lead to more memory. You'll remember things better in new locations. So likewise, with using multiple memory palaces, theoretically, this, when I get the budget, and if anybody wants to, start helping me gather that budget, we'll go in and we'll do some brain scans here. But theoretically, multiple memory palaces gets you more familiar and acquainted with the technique because of some level of norepinephrine in multiple locations, using it in multiple locations. But even if that isn't true and doesn't bear out in scientific testing, it will still be true because using it in multiple locations will show you some of the unique ins and outs of how this technique works in different kinds of space so that you get much more familiar with it much faster. And there's really no lack of benefit. There's nothing that can go wrong with this. Your spatial memory abilities just increase incredibly. Plus, you get all of the benefits of accessing more autobiographical memory, more episodic memory, etc. And then when you start to put in your magnetic imagery, then you get the benefits of more fusion in more places so that you're able to do this just on the fly when you start to use impromptu memory palaces. All right, so DJ says, I'm learning Italian and only have 21. I believe, if memory serves, that makes sense given the way the Italian alphabet works. Mr. Space says, I'm lazy, so it's going slowly. Well, what can we do to help you with that? Richard says he's here hello from Rick in Florida. Good to see you, Rick. Thanks for being here. Wonderful. Florida. Got to get there one of these days. All right. So another thing that you can do to help is when you're in discussions and so forth, if you want more than one point, use the fist, but you can also use a memory palace for key points. And there's lots of ways to do this. You can use the person's body as a memory palace, use your body, you can use the room, etc. Lots and lots of fun things to do in this case. You can also just take notes. There's no shame in taking notes and memorizing things later. And one of the problems is that people try to do too much, right? And so it depends on the nature of the conversation. But if people are just memorizing like book titles or whatever, you can just make an impromptu memory palace for that. Or they're memorizing other names, or they're mentioning other names and you want to memorize those things, then you can just do that spontaneously. But if it's some super intense, detailed thing, there's no shame in taking notes and memorizing from the notes later. All right, so that's a behavioral solution for a behavioral problem. Using the body as a memory palace, well, I wouldn't get so granular as the head, nose, and the mouth, or the nose and the mouth in the head, but certainly the head, shoulders, arms, legs, etc. It's better less is more in this particular case. There's some exceptions to that rule, such as when you're memorizing human anatomy, and certainly been some interesting things that people have done with that. All right, so another behavior that people do that is a cause of forgetting, a major cause of forgetting in the behavioral category, is they're not effectively encoding. So let's get deeper into these techniques. We've seen all kinds of things that interfere, but when we're talking about the technique specifically, people are not effectively encoding. And that means that they're, above all, they're not prepared, right? They haven't done the training and they haven't put in the practice. And doing training, if you need help on the YouTube channel, there's a whole thing about how to take a memory course, how to make sure you actually have taken it and put some of that stuff into practice, because that's the only way that it's going to happen. You have to have thorough understanding and you have to put it into practice. There's no magic formulas or special, bullets that are going to fly from the sky that make this happen in any other way. Thorough understanding from books, from video courses, whatever it is, and then practicing what's said there. Study these techniques, implement what you learn, practice, and then go back and study them some more. Implement what you find in the studies, and then practice some more. Ideally practicing with information that improves your life. This is very, very important. And another reason why that people have issues with effective encoding is because they're not using all of the magnetic modes, right? And not only that, but they're not getting enough sound meaning correspondence. So the magnetic modes are useful, but if you're not getting enough sound meaning correspondence, you can have all the magnetic modes under the sun, and that's not quite going to land it. So you need a sound meaning correspondence. You need to make sure that semantic and echoic memory are working in correspondence along with all your episodic memory tools, etc. That's all the science words. Another thing is not using bulletproof memory palaces. So a lot of people, they're not really making them correctly. And there is a correct, actually. And correct is a little bit relative, but not too much. And so there's wiggle room and so forth, but there's some very good principles, all of which are covered at magneticmemorymethod.com/YT. If you haven't taken that course, please register for it. RJ Israel is here. Thank you for being here. And you say, my first time participating in your chat, so I'm under the impression anyone, for the most part, can improve their memory. Yes, RJ, anyone can. The only people who can't are the ones who decide that they can't. I've never met anybody who can't improve their memory, except for those who tell themselves the story, and we talked about stories before, who they just decide that they can't do it. And you know what? They're probably right. They're probably right. So you say, for those in university, record your audio lectures and focus on the... Oh, sorry, this is Adolfo now. But RJ says, memory course, my first time hearing about this. Yeah, well, please register for the free one at magneticmemorymethod.com/YT, or go straight for gold in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass if you wish. And either way, the whole point is get memory training, because people who aren't fully versed in these techniques, they could save themselves a lot of time, a lot of pain, a lot of hassle, and just go direct for what works, especially in terms of encoding. And then the other problem, the behavioral problem, which we'll talk about in a minute. But there are much faster and more direct paths, to be sure. Chronoman Walking says, oh, I wonder why your chat didn't show up on the screen here. Thank you for that super chat. I really appreciate that. It's weird, though. It doesn't show up on our message here. So what I'm going to do is copy and paste it so everyone can see that. I don't know why it doesn't show up on our screen. I guess it shows up on the YouTube screen. I'm going to feature that, though, on our screen for Facebook and other places. Chrome Woman Walking says, wow, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. So that should show up now for everybody. Regardless of where you are in the world, should show up. Come on, internet. There we go. Chrome Walking says, I have to go do my bedtime routine for prep for work next week, or the work week. Love the replays. I would love to see a show where memory masters get together and talk about their routines. I've been working to put together a roundtable with a bunch of people, and hopefully we're going to do that in the near future. Thanks for that suggestion. But yeah, that would That would be amazing, and hopefully that will happen soon. Thanks for the suggestion, and thank you again for the super chat. And thanks to everybody who supports the channel. If you're new here, hit the thumbs up, get subscribed. If you're not subscribed, hit the bell icon so you get notified when we go live. And by the way, some people have been saying they're not being notified. I guess you have to actually tell your device also that you want notifications from YouTube. And Month says, a 14-year-old memory master. How does that sound? Well, I believe there was a 14-year-old who just broke a Guinness World Record, so it's possible. I think she's around 14. And if she isn't, she's nearby that age, but I think that's exactly the age. As everybody knows, I'm not that interested in the memory competition world, but that was a very interesting story. So follow up on that. But yeah, you can do it, Monst. If that's how we're pronouncing your name, Monst. I love that. Please do. Please do. And, the younger that you get at it, the more profound you're going to be. I mean, I can imagine once you're 84, if you started now and you kept going, man, your brain and your memory would be massive. Massive. All right. John Boy 700 says, question. Thanks for being here, by the way, John Boy. Good to see you. Is it half-stepping to just make associations for a word versus putting it in a mind palace? I go over word lists of Hebrew and only do links and associations to the word by itself. I would argue that it is definitely something in the half area, but it depends. If you can get it back without a memory palace, I mean, power to you, man. That's amazing. I couldn't do it. I need the extra reference. And, I shouldn't say I couldn't do it. I shouldn't tell myself that story. I can do it from time to time, but it's not good for recall rehearsal to have it in the void of the mind. And so you got to kind of think about, can you scale it, right? How many exact words can you do? Can you do 260 that way, for example, right? And I couldn't. And I could work up to it, I'm sure. I'm sure anybody could work up to it if they wanted to. But at what point does it begin to have a regressive effect, right? At what point does it start to interfere with itself? And how is that relative to your goals? So I don't think there's a right or wrong to it. It's just a question of strategy and scale. So I would be interested in hearing more details about it. But it may or may not be half-stepping relative to your goals and to your accuracy of recall and how that accuracy holds out and pans out over larger amounts of vocabulary. And so this kind of comes to, okay, so you have 10,000 words that you've memorized? Is that what you're saying? You've memorized 10,000 words without a memory palace? If so, then, we need to get you on the show and you need to be talking about it. And we need to study something about how that you're doing that and how that you're organizing it so others can model this. Because when I think of people like Dr. Yip and their own, the incredible reliance on a memory palace in order to make that happen, just seems kind of it's possible, but take probably much longer and the recall would be in question. Okay, so this sounds more realistic. Yeah. Well, 50 words. If you want to scale it out, I'm almost certain you're going to want to have a memory palace technique. But even 50 words, if you're doing that without a memory palace, I mean, all that tells me is you're going to go much further, much faster, and with much better recall rates by using a memory palace network. So you're like the perfect candidate for extending to a memory palace so that you can accelerate to 10,000 words much, much faster and just be able to add phrases to all of them with much greater ease because of having a memory palace in the mix. Pick your path and, split test it. And I've seen similar stories, similar situations, and the people are like, man, I wish I would have just had a memory palace from the beginning because of exactly this. And there's people even with rote learning stories who've done tons with rote learning, and still they say, oh man, I wish I would have done it with the memory palace. There's also the opposite story though. So a lot of polyglots are so good with rote, or that's not even rote, actually, that's not right, because they know how to use rote creatively. They're still using mnemonics, but they're so good with it. But they still go to the memory palace when they work with what they call the stubborn quintile. And the stubborn quintile is like this 5 to 20% of words. They just can't, for whatever reason, memorize them. It's not exactly clear why they can't memorize them, although when I've worked with some of them and helped them, we've we figure it out. And it's usually one of these topics that we're talking about today, or they're not using word division enough, or they're not effectively encoding properly, even though they use creative repetition. I'm doing a big creative rote experiment right now, and it's pretty interesting, and it's all the same problems at the end of the day. So it'd just be easier and faster to use a memory palace, but need to explore it. In any case, yeah, I'd say that in most cases people are half-stepping it, but there's different ways to do it and so forth. And if you're not going to use memory palaces, then what ends up happening is you put a greater burden on discipline with some kind of serial positioning strategy that essentially can't be optimized in the same way. It can't be strategized in the same way, but it maybe can be strategized in your context in a way that's just as effective. It's not that different at the end of the day. And so people to look at, are the polyglots, and to understand exactly what it is that they're doing with cards, because they'll say it in shorthand and it'll sound like they're just looking at their cards, but they're usually using some sort of associative strategy. So John Boy 700 says, I did a palace for some of the tenses, and it's like a robot. I can't forget it. It seems like. There you go. So proof of concept is already in your head, and that proof of concept will be powerful in every possible way as you continue to practice. And then again, you have the benefit of having this palette laid out for you that is so good for extending the vocabulary into phrases. All right, so carrying on, part of our not effectively encoding is not effectively creating those memory palaces in the first place. Go to magneticmemorymethod.com/YT if you haven't taken the free course to get effective memory palace creation going for yourself. And why that this is so important, why having enough emphasis on the magnetic modes with sound meaning, is because if you don't have that in well-formed memory palaces, you're not getting enough internal and external cues. So external cues and internal cues, at some level they're the same, because what isn't internal? But you need that level of cues. And this is why in large memorization projects, I couldn't do the Sanskrit stuff that I'm doing, or even the Chinese stuff, without the combination of these things, because it needs the actual way that I'll get the recall going during recall rehearsal so that I can escape the memory palace and just do it off the top of my head, is because of the large number of cues that are available. So you'll have the memory palace as a cue. You'll have how this or that part of the word is a cue, and you won't necessarily access them all exactly the same. But the more that you have, the more likely you'll get something that allows the first domino to topple. But the more you restrict, the more you're relying on one thing to be the cue. But the more cues you have, then the more you're going to be able to get that thing rolling. So it's a very, very important part of encoding. And that's essentially what effective encoding is having enough internal and external cues to be able to start the ball rolling so that you can recall it, and then following up so that you're recalling it enough to get it into long-term memory. And the beauty of the memory palace, as opposed to other strategies, is that you're able to place an emphasis on primacy and recency using serial positioning so that you can actually reduce that amount of needed repetition, which is doesn't play out as well in the ways that a lot of people use flashcards. But they could use flashcards in that way if they wanted, provided that they create their flashcards appropriately. And this is where people like Gabriel Weiner with Fluent Forever did a really great thing for people by making sure they're creating their flashcards appropriately and properly. And that's not really reflected in some of the software versions of those techniques. And those software versions actually make it very difficult to do that, if not impossible, and much less likely for people to do that due to the nature of how those things work. And that's just nothing anybody should punish themselves about. It's just ridiculously torturous and long and painful and lacks creativity to do so. So no wonder they don't do it. All right. So let's check in with the chat. Mr. Space says, maybe it's mind jerking, but sometimes things look so familiar. I think what to remember here. Details are the big picture. Give us an example so this is a little more concrete for us, Mr. Space, please. Sounds very interesting what you're talking about, but what is something that looks so familiar that you mistake the forest for the trees? Please elaborate. Scott says, would making a memory palace with empty information for words to memorize to fit in depending on the context work? Would making a memory palace with empty information for words to memorize to fit in? I am not following, like sentences or phrases. I'm still not following. Please say more. What do you mean? An empty memory palace or with empty information? I don't quite follow. Please say more about your idea. Now, there's another behavioral cause of forgetting, following not effectively encoding, and that is not effectively decoding, right? And so decoding is when you've made magnetic imagery, it's in your memory palaces, then you go back and you go, what was that happening there? So one of my favorite is vimuktidam in Sanskrit. So there's Vim vendors, and there's a cow, moo, and he's got a tea bag, and he's hitting the Hoover Dam, Vimukti Dam, and it means liberator, right? And the actual phrase is Atmajanam Chitanasha, Atmajanam Vimuktidam, Atmajanam Bayanasham, Atmajanam Sukhavaham. And basically, in that case, it's just beautiful. Oh, get a little dopamine spike out of that. Forgive me if I start to seem drunk. But in that case, Vimuktidam is liberator. And wow, the thing is in order to effectively encode it, we've got to effectively decode it. And so that means going back and saying, okay, so what was there? And the first cue is obviously the memory palace, but sometimes you just get another thing. But in this case, what I would remember sometimes is just the moo, right? And then it's like, well, who's on the cow, right? Oh, well, it was Vim vendors. So then Vimuktidam. An interesting note here for those who are really into this is that you can also use some of your numbers, right? So dam for me is 13 because it's the Hoover Dam. And so we can also just make a note in the encoding process to also have this 13. And I think of the Black Sabbath album 13 and hear a bit of Ozzy in there to get some auditory stuff. And that really, really helps. So that's one thing to consider is how are you decoding? And in this case, one of the problems is all in the encoding process, right? And then needing the outcome, needing it to be that you get it perfectly. Well, I didn't get it perfectly the first time I recalled it. Instead, I was like moo, and I had to connect back. I got moo first when I should have got vim, right? But by not being a perfectionist and just allowing it to be as it was, got it all back on the first recall, and then going back into proper recall rehearsal. Now, a lot of people get into the rule of 5, and this is actually too little for most people. But it can sometimes be too much, depending on the nature of the information. So you've got to keep in consideration what is the information itself and in what context, and you really want to understand that it's very difficult to do any recall rehearsal without effective encoding, and it's very difficult to do recall rehearsal without being able to let go of the outcome. Because if you put too much pressure on needing the outcome, you'll frustrate yourself at the first sign of resistance and your memory not working. And if you don't have some faith that it will work, then you can frustrate yourself to the nth degree, which happens all the time. So effectively decoding requires behaviors of actually being willing to do more recall rehearsal than, some of the biggest memory champions say that you need to do, because you might need to. It is sometimes dealing with the frustration that you might not need to do that much, and you might need to do it unevenly, because in a phrase like Atmajanam Vimuktidam, you may need to do Vimuktidam more than Atmajanam, whatever, but you just got to be willing to deal with that and be cool, be calm, be relaxed. It's the ABC principle. Always be cool. Always be cool. So the solution is ultimately practice, right? That's always the solution. It's just more practice, more practice. All right, let's check in with our chat. If you're just joining us, hit the thumbs up. Let me know where you are in the world, what you're doing, what you're thinking. And so Mr. Space carries on. For example, I'm on the bus while going to work. I think of how to create memory palace from house to work or each location separately. For example, the bus has its own microstations like seats and handles. So, yeah, I mean, what's the problem again? I'm not quite following what's the problem. But the big picture is here's the big picture. The big picture is, if I'm understanding, is how can you turn that memory palace into a good memory palace like that without overthinking it? And could you count all the seats and use every seat as a memory palace? Yes, of course. But is that the most effective way to do it? Probably not. Probably the most effective way to use a bus is back of the bus, middle of the bus, front of the bus. Done. That's 3 stations, and it's only 3 stations when you could have, 93, whatever the size of the bus is, right? 54. But at the end of the day, are you going to sit there and really use a memory palace that way as opposed to 3? Now, you could readily turn that 3 into 9 by having below the bus, 1, 2, 3, in the bus, 1, 2, 3, and above the bus, 1, 2, 3. That may make a journey that interferes with itself, or it may not, depending on how imaginatively you use it. So if you start at the tailpipe and you go forward, then you enter the bus and go backwards and exit through the back and then go through the roof, then you don't cross your own path. It's smooth and flawless. Likewise, you can start on the roof above the driver, go backwards, go back in, like that. That can be 9. You could get more than 9. You could go, so you're on the roof and you're at the steering wheel side, you go over to the entrance side, then you go back to, let's call this, I'm in Australia now, the entrance is on the other side, so let's use New York here. I guess the driver, wow, how does that work? Yeah, the entrance would be on the right side, then you go over there, and then you go over there, and then you go over there, and then you go down, and then you repeat that inside the bus itself, and you repeat that. So now you got many, many more stations, right? You can play with that. And at the end of the day, let's not mistake the big picture for the details. What matters is that you actually have a memory palace you can use, and then you go and use it. And make it more complicated after. So if you can't use 3 stations in a bus, keep using buses until you can use 3 stations. Then go to the 9 version or the 6 version, roof and inside. Because you might find that underneath doesn't work for you. Because you may be like, well, how am I going to squeeze in these giant superheroes and so forth? And what if the superheroes that are underneath the bus throw the bus, and that screws up my memory of the inside of the bus because you can't separate yet multiple versions of buses? Make sure you got the basic skills before you go for gold. Because you'll get to gold sooner by mastering the basics than you will by putting the cart ahead of the horse. I don't know if I'm exactly in line with what it is that you're asking about, but I hope that helps you nonetheless. All right. Neri is in the house. So great to see you again with another great lesson. Great to see you here. Thanks for saying hello. If you're just joining us, hit the thumbs up. Let me know where you are in the world, what you're doing, what you're thinking. And by the way, that whole thumbs up stuff is very, very important for telling the robots that humans care about the memory tradition, they care about this particular manifestation of the teaching, and all the more so as the corporate takeover takes over the internet and turns it into network television, which is unforgiving, tragically boring, and not search-oriented, which I'm sure they're going to try and get rid of search as soon as they possibly can. All right, so Month says, I actually made a memory palace with a bus, but it was small. I wouldn't recommend it. Well, I would recommend buses, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend making them overburdened with too many stations, even though you could. I like to use buses from time to time, but the thing is that it's how you use it and what you're using it for that really, really matters. And if you're learning a foreign language, why not just use it for back of the bus, middle of the bus, front of the bus, and some related terminology? Buses can be good, can be powerful. All right, let's check in with Scott and try to put his 2 chats together. So starting at the beginning, would making a memory palace with empty information for words to memorize to fit in depending on the context of the work, like sentences or phrases, like identifying the words to be memorized as verbs, nouns, pronouns, etc., and build sentences that can make these words fit, like Mark ate his dinner quickly. Yeah, you can do that. I personally don't think that there's any particular benefit to doing that, but you can. So if I understand correctly, you're talking about parts of speech. Memory palace is for parts of speech. And it can be useful for certain things, to be sure. So if you wanted to know irregular versus regular verbs, you can have a memory palace with 10 regular verbs and sentences that feature that and 10 that don't. And then you can go through all the tenses and the numbers that may affect that, etc. That, I think, is a case for that. However, the extent to which that it's necessary to do so and will be useful to the individual learner, yes. Gathering together a bunch of nouns and so forth, well, sure, why not? If that's your bag. But I would then suggest just alphabetizing them anyway, so that you have the benefits of alphabetization, which can be very, very powerful. At the end of the day, what matters is that each person develops their own mnemonic style, gives things a try, and by try, I mean the old college try, which is like putting in some real experimentation before you decide. Don't decide too soon. So many people are so snap. They just decide that things won't work within 2 or 3 seconds these days. And they probably always were that way, actually. And I'm not sure it's new with the internet. But, they've given statistics in different places that 98% of people just give up on the first try when they quote unquote fail. Instead of learning from what went wrong there, they're already gone. And, so it goes sometimes. Well, thanks, DJ, for being here. Glad you loved the information today, and we look forward to seeing you the next time. Good night. Good to see you. Thank you so much for being here and engaged. Mr. Space says, so big picture was from home to work places without going into microstations, nouns in general. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, maybe you want to go back through the vision statement live stream that we did and create a vision statement that helps guide these decisions so that you don't overwhelm yourself and you have a solid learning plan based on a vision of what you want your life to be, that you really authentically want your life to be, and then just dive in and do that, right? And it doesn't matter what other people are doing. All that matters is, what do you want to do? Because a major cause of forgetting, of course, is that people are living unfulfilled lives because they don't have a vision for their life. And not having a vision for your life is really the quickest path for all kinds of suffering and forgetting to do the things that work. Because there are things that work, and there are things that are known to work, and usually they require a bit of effort, and that effort is well worth doing, but people run at the first sign of struggle or pain, which is very, very sad, and everybody does it. That's the whole thing. But the differentiating factor is who shows up again despite that presence of pain and so forth. All right, so the solution for encoding and decoding issues is practice, and not just any practice, but practice that comes with analysis to guide improvement over time. And we've talked about that so many times that we can probably just barrel forward with the next behavioral issue. And this is a real big one. It's a real big one. And if you get this, you will figure out so much. And it's the problem of not understanding that memory is a behavior. Your memory is not a thing. It's not a unitary mechanism. It's a behavior. It's something that we do. And why that's so important is that a healthy brain and body must be matched by exercise and practice. So there's the exercise and practice of the body and the exercise and the practice of the mind. And put these things together in order to have the biggest punch and understand that it's all behavior. Everything is behavior at the end of the day. Mr. Space says, my vision is to be able to learn the language and skills easily. Well, I'm not sure that that's the kind of vision that I'm talking about. So please go back and check out that live stream. I think you'll find it very, very helpful and useful. Mr. Space asks, how long do you think it takes to master any skill? Let me ask you this, Mr. Space. Why do you think it matters what I think? And do you think that there's actually an answer for that? And if there is an answer, do you think it applies to you or to any person meaningfully? How long it takes to master anything is a trap. It's a question that has no answer. It's a question that doesn't even need an answer. What is mastery? Mastery is continuing to practice even after you no longer need to practice. So it has no end. Mastery is not a thing that has a length of time that it takes. It's not a question that has an answer. And here's the true sign of mastery. If there is a true sign, this is it. Why was Da Vinci a master of his craft? Because you know his name, I know his name, and humans continue to practice his teaching as they feature the fruit of his teaching. Now, that's not going to happen to all of us, but it is the true sign of mastery. Mastery is when you do something that maybe not your entire culture or the entire world remembers and carries forward into history, but that somebody carries forward in their own lives. That is beyond yourself. That is for the world rather than just for you, because you've practiced it to a point that you continue practicing it even when you don't need practice anymore. Because the reality is the master knows that it is practice above all that the master needs. And this is true in just about every realm. So that's what mastery is all about. In my humble, well, not always so humble, but certainly always magnetic opinion. All right, and so this is why the body must be practiced, even when you feel like you need no more practice. And I can tell you, when the gym across the street closed, and I just thought, well, they're renovating, maybe I just take a break. Well, by the time I got back to that gym, I couldn't do pull-ups anymore. Even though I had been doing pull-ups and adding 15, 20 kilo with a chain and a belt to my waist in such a short period of time, I couldn't do it anymore because I didn't practice. I didn't keep up the practice. And I fully hope, and I'm back at the gym now and doing pull-ups again, but I fully hope to be doing pull-ups when I'm 97. But in order to get there, I'm going to need to keep practicing. And that mastery will be there to the extent to which I remember that rule about mastery. And Neri loves the answer about mastery. Excellent, thank you. Mr. Space, or Adolfo says to Mr. Space, I began with 10 stations for my initial MPs. Through practice now, I can easily have over 100 stations in my Mary Palaces if needed. Excellent, and that's a great point about practice. And Adolfo is a great practitioner and demonstrator of just how much practice can do for you and how rapidly it can do so for achieving large memory goals and scoring so well on tests. So what's the ultimate behavior here in addition to just practicing memory techniques? I say pick a large learning goal and a short daily memory exercise. So one of the shortest daily memory exercises I know is just some cards, playing cards. It doesn't have to be cards with playing card images on them. It can be cards with vocabulary or names of people, etc. in different configurations, but have a large one. So my large one, as you probably know, is essentially emulating the Gary Weber Sanskrit stuff that he has shared. So far, so good. And this is really, really important because it's really large. It's a lot of Sanskrit. And wow, I have more in my head than I ever thought I would have of anything. And it's very, very impactful. But it's not a replacement for also short little daily memory exercises. And Chinese also has that short little daily memory exercise characteristic to it as well. But if you want to, I really suggest you exercise 2 levels. Something that's short and brief and crisp, and a larger project like learning a language. And show up to it consistently. So something like language learning and cards would be very, very powerful. And then in terms of the biological realm, pick one area of health to work on, and then pick something else after you've mastered that. So for example, you can pick an area of health to work on, and that could be diet. And one of the things I've worked on a lot is diet. And one of the things that's cool to do is you could use your memory techniques to practice diet. So memorize words related to diet. So an example in my own realm here was learning these words for these words for diet: sattvic, tamasic, and rajasic. And when I learned those foods, it was one thing to just go, oh, there's these 3 categories of foods, but then to memorize it helps guide the practice of eating better, because it's in the mind. The actual words and the concepts that they refer to is in the mind. And so that helps a great deal. And so really, the whole thing is that causes of forgetting are very, very easy to contend with. There may be other causes of forgetting. I don't pretend to have covered them all on this live stream, but I imagine that the others somehow connect with these in many, many ways. And surely we can assemble some more. So if you think of any, please let me know. Please jam them out through email, or if you're watching the replay, put them in the discussion below. If you're new here, make sure you get subscribed to this channel, hit that bell icon, and hit the thumbs up if you haven't already. And, well, great session today, everybody. Thanks for being so active in the chat. I'm going to scroll through here for a minute, see if I missed anything. And if you have anything else that you want to comment on or ask, now's your chance as I quickly scan through to make sure that I did not miss anything whatsoever. And I see Mr. Space has something else to say. Your diet is no carbs, no sugar, fast, 16 hours. Excellent. Yeah, these days I'm fasting once a week now, and that's a very, very good fast. I like that. I used to do 2 days a week, which I may return to at some point in the future, but for now, 1 day a week is great. And yeah, on the matter of food, stay tuned as I continue to do this memory supplement experiment, and I'm being a bit hush-hush about it because obviously I'm not going to reveal the name of the product without actually wanting to stand behind it. So far, not too impressed, but like I say, I'm going to finish the trial with the product, then I'm going to try and create it myself because it has the names of all the ingredients and see. And just generally, I think it's a very interesting thing to test my own assumptions about the world and these things, and I always benefit a great deal when I do. And I certainly have tested my assumptions about things like virtual memory palaces and VR memory palaces. And luckily, people like Adolfo have helped me test those assumptions and confirm that. But stay tuned, because in the near future, we'll do a live stream all about VR and virtual memory palaces and some real big smack hammer arguments against it from VR developers themselves. All right. So Adolfo asks, how's the book coming along? Well, thanks for asking, and thank you for your ongoing interest with the book. It is coming along well. I was actually working on it the other day, and I just need to really fix some elements in it. And also on I don't know if he's still here, but William was on the chat earlier. I believe on the 22nd and 24th, we said we're going to shoot some of the photographs that we need for the book. And I'm really looking forward to that. So I want him above all to be the photographer, because he's a great photographer and also has an interest in the topic itself. So that's what needs to be remained. I've got to change some stuff that has since been updated in my own experience. And then we need to find a way to really visualize as well as possible the actual memory palaces in a way that I don't think has ever been done in a book before. So yeah, just, it's just the extra elbow grease kind of thing so that it can stand the test of time insofar as anybody can ever predict that. But I'm always keen to making things better than before, and then this be sort of the best that I can make it on this particular topic and for helping people with what I think that it can do. And yeah, I hope it's a bit of an experiment, because it's kind of got moonwalking with Einstein in mind as a point of reference, but also things like the Bhagavad Gita as a point of reference, as strange as those two things may be together, and just a lot of mnemonic examples as well. And mnemonic examples are always very tough because they're not the key. They're not the secret. The secret is to get you to make your own mnemonic examples and ignore the mnemonic examples of others because they're not really going to work for you. That said, I had an idea about mnemonic examples. So if you're on my mailing list, that will be coming soon. And I'd like to hear back from you when that message goes out, because it may be an opportunity to work together in a way that I am interested to see if it will work. And it could solve some problems with the seemingly undying need for oodles of mnemonic examples out there. But I want real mnemonic examples, not just ones that are possible to come up with, as so many corporations seem so willing to do, just for the sake of grinding out more stuff. All right. Not that I have anything against more stuff, by the way. It's coming whether we like it or not. So be at peace with the world as it is. Hope everybody enjoyed today's session. I certainly enjoyed making this with you together in our great collaboration and assemblage of beings around the world. I hope you will join us again in the future and come visit me at magneticmarymethod.com. If you don't have the free course, get it at magneticmarymethod.com/YT. And until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.
Hey everybody, so I'm here in the Atlanta airport. I was just thinking about how grateful and thankful I am for what Anthony did for me. I do seminars all across the country, usually have about 100 to 300 people every single weekend, and one of my biggest goals was to be able to memorize their names, and started studying some stuff and learning, and it wasn't connecting as fast as it needed to, and I just wasn't connecting the dots, and started doing some research online, and there I found Anthony. And Anthony, I just want to tell you thank you very much for all that you've done. Now, man, my memorization is through the roof. I've almost reached my goal of getting 300 people at one time. I'm not exactly there yet. I'm off just by a few, but I'll get there as I keep practicing and keep connecting what I've learned from you and what you've put and you've helped me with. And so I just want to tell everybody, if you're looking to take your memory palaces and your memory techniques to the next level, I mean, Anthony's the guy. If he can help me go from not even remembering people's names, and that's the biggest issue of my life in my seminars, to actually being able to memorize over 100 and something people's names, close to 200, man, he can help any of you guys out with anything. So I just want to give a shout out to Anthony. Very thankful, very grateful for meeting you. Very thankful for the fact that as soon as I sent you an email, you responded very quickly, very promptly. You just opened up your time and gave me a scheduled time very quickly also. And the support afterwards was well above and beyond. I mean, you could have ended it right there, but he didn't. He kept emailing me and make sure I was okay, and would send me emails periodically to make sure that I was following up and following through. So again, just want to thank you very much, Anthony. As I'm walking through this airport, getting ready to jump on a plane to Seattle, I was just thinking about how grateful and thankful I am for you being in my life and for helping me take those steps to the next level. And if anyone is out there is ever thinking about, should I work with Anthony, the answer is absolutely, unequivocally yes, beyond the shadow of a doubt. I could probably keep going on and on. But again, thank you, Anthony. And I really appreciate you. You've been a blessing in my life.